Hello everyone, this is Steven Shinder Reviews in video form, and I'm here with another Planet of the Apes video. A common misconception I've seen over the years from moviegoers is that the Planet of the Apes reboot films since 2011 are prequels, when really, in the strictest sense, they are not. Rise of the Planet of the Apes is an origin story, sure, but it is a reboot, with its sequels contributing to a newer continuity. But it doesn't help when you have people behind the scenes saying they're building up to the 1968 film. The Planet of the Apes wiki includes a page titled Planet of the Apes 20th Century Reboot, and it supposedly includes quotes by Rupert Wyatt. I do not have access to the actual sources that they cite, but I do remember reading these sentences around the time Rise came out. Apparently, in August 2011 issue of Sci-Fi Magazine, he said, "In this film, we see television footage of the Icarus taking off from Earth." So that's a clear reference to the 1968 film, because that's the ship Charlton Heston and his crew were on. This is primarily a prequel to the 1968 film. The page also cites a quote from an article titled "The Great Escape" by Dan Joplin, from that same month's issue of Empire magazine. "We've gone a very different route that's restarting the myth, with the hope this will be the first film that takes us 2,000 years to reach the original Planet of the Apes." I've taken these comments to not be in a literal sense so much as a spiritual sense. Like, if you look at mythology, these are stories of how apes became dominant, and then you have the story of how an astronaut comes back and sees apes are dominant, and then we see what happens after that. In fact, this same page includes quotes from writer Rick Jaffa, producer Dylan Clark, and even Wyatt himself, pretty much emphasizing that it's not a prequel and more of its own thing. But all that aside for a moment, what if these films did retroactively end up becoming prequels to the classic films? It would have to involve retconning and some squinting, so I kind of want to do a thought experiment, trying to figure out what it could look like if we view these films as prequels that lead to the classic ones. I should preface this by saying I do not look at them that way, and would not want this idea to come true necessarily. You could definitely poke some holes, I welcome that, but it's a thought experiment I've been interested in trying ever since I encountered Wes Ball's comment in an interview with Games Radar Plus and the Inside Total Film podcast. In my mind, if we had our choice, we wouldn't go back and remake the 1968 version. We would build all the way up to it, then start over. Just go back and watch the 68 version and the franchise through. For the sake of simplicity, I'm not going to include the TV shows or the 2001 film, or any other expanded materials, as much as I do like trying to fit some of this stuff together, given the time travel shenanigans. I'm just gonna stick strictly to the classic pentalogy and the newer films from 2011 onward, and there will be light spoilers for those films. So let's remind ourselves of the Apes' backstory alluded to in the classic films. According to lore we learn in Escape, some apes have secret knowledge that humans were dominant until apes took over something like the mid-26th century, with an ape named Aldo saying no. You could chalk this up to inaccurate estimates and history being lost to time. People use this reasoning when looking at that pentalogy as a circular timeline. The idea there is that escape, conquest, and battle happened in the past of this same timeline that ends with POTA 68 and beneath. Others like to use contradictory info within the lore to make a case for a new past having been created via the Aponauts' backward time travel in Escape. For the sake of trying to fit the newer films, let's use the latter hypothesis and place the newer films in the past, starting around 2,000 years before POTA 68. In Rise, we do see a space shuttle Icarus take off. Behind the scenes, writers have said it's supposed to be Taylor on the shuttle, and Icarus is the nickname for the original Liberty 1 ship. The news publicizes this as a mission to Mars, though in the 1968 film, it seems their mission is to go to a distant star. You might be able to headcanon some sort of conspiracy theory, that going to Mars was for the public to believe, but going to another star system was the secret mission. The general public perhaps might not have been deemed ready to know of such a plan to colonize another star system. So let's say this is the exact same Taylor we see in the 68 film. An inconsistency one would notice is that in POTA 68, the chronometer shows it was 1972 when Taylor left Earth, whereas Rise is in the early 21st century. The beginning of Rise, set 8 years prior, does show a projection graph beginning in the year 2011, which would lead one to believe the bulk of the film is 2019. But other materials have claimed the ape uprising in Rise took place either 2011 or 2016. So right there, the year is inconsistent anyway. Even in the classic films, whether Taylor lands in the 3970s or 3950s is inconsistent. So a way of potentially making all this work together is to look at these films through the lens of a floating timeline or comic book time, where the launch of the shuttle and the ape uprising take place in our present or near future relative to whenever we're watching these films as they come out. For those not familiar with the concept of a floating timeline, think of a classic example like The Simpsons. Characters like Bart, Lisa, and Maggie do not age, really. They stay the same age, even though we see clearly that the years are changing. The show is staying contemporary to whatever year in which it airs. They've even had to retcon when certain events in Homer and Marge's past took place in order to take into account when the show takes place now and how much time in the past that would have been for the characters, shifting events from around 1980 to sometime in the 90s as far as their backstory is concerned. The term comic book time is also used because the same is true of comic book characters. You could have characters go through all these different comic book stories released over the course of a decade or more, and to them it may have been just a year or a couple years as far as how much they have aged and whatnot, even though we see that the contemporary time period is always changing. This is why you can keep Spider-Man relatively young, or have Batman not grow too old. There is a sliding time scale. Sometimes there are events where they say, oh, that happened this amount of years ago, or when I was this age, but the specific year for such events might change depending on when the present currently takes place, as of the most recent story's release. So Taylor goes up, the Andy Serkis Caesar has his uprising, simian flu spreads, lowering the human population and allowing apes to evolve. Koba has his rebellion about a decade later. Caesar confronts the Colonel's people a couple years after that. 300 years later, we get the events of Kingdom, during which humans have devolved, but there are still smart humans in hiding, trying to regain the Earth. And then we have many years to play with before Taylor returns to Earth in the 40th century. The events of Beneath happen shortly after, ending the timeline. Now we get to the backwards time travel. The Aponauts go back in time, landing in the present/near future. Here's where it gets tricky. If both shuttle launches, the one in Rise and the one prior to Escape, are one and the same, then you kind of have to stretch your suspension of disbelief, even with the comic book time lens in mind. In Escape, it is said that Taylor has been gone for 2 years. So if this is meant to be 2 years or even a year after Rise, it feels weird. The humans don't seem like they have witnessed or heard about Circus Caesar's uprising in San Francisco. The birth of baby Milo seems like the first instance they're super concerned about intelligent apes taking over. and it doesn't seem like simian flu has affected the human population yet. I suppose one way you could try to look at this is that the aponauts, rather than landing in a past period of their already established timeline before revising it, actually went into an alternate universe, where some things are already kind of different before the point of their arrival. But let's go this other direction. So another thing you could do is ignore the 2 years comment. I mean, even in Escape, it already feels inconsistent, given it's 1973 and yet Taylor was shown to have gone up in 72. You could pretend there's a shorter gap between Event A, which would be the launch and the Circus Caesar uprising, and Event B, the arrival of the aponauts. Maybe simian flu is a thing, but there haven't been enough casualties yet for people to be concerned. In the next film, Conquest, we do learn that by 1983, or 8 years after Rise and Escape in this hypothetical, a virus killed all the cats and dogs, though this does not seem to be the simian flu, as it is said to have been brought back to Earth by astronauts. Maybe the arrival of the aponauts inspired another astronaut mission that ended up happening during the events of the film or shortly thereafter. Maybe some other astronauts came down shortly after Escape and seemed really ill. And here's where you can go wild with sci-fi explanations. Maybe the virus from space, spreading across the world, somehow made the simian flu less effective against humans, hence why the human population still seems to be thriving when baby Milo, or McDowell Caesar, is 18 in Conquest. And even if the simian flu no longer kills many humans, it still makes the apes around the world smarter. Meanwhile, the virus from space wipes out the cats and dogs, and humans are inspired to put apes in servitude. In Conquest, McDowell Caesar is the one who leads the apes. Maybe with there being more plentiful humans, something happened to Circus Caesar, preventing him from becoming the mythological Caesar of this new timeline. Conquest is followed by a war. Then we get the events of battle, maybe over a decade after Conquest. And of course there's coincidentally a major ape named Aldo. We see an epilogue 700 years later, where humans and apes are friendly with each other. And whatever happens after that is anyone's guess. So yeah, this is a way one could reason that the newer films may lead to the classic films. It's certainly a route that those behind the franchise could take if they so choose, but it's not something I necessarily want. I like viewing these different takes as their own worlds, and it makes the future post-Kingdom feel so much freer if we don't expect it to just end up how things are in POTA 68. But I'm also not going to say you should not do some sort of viewing marathon where you can watch the Rise series and then follow that up with the classic series. Again, it could be fun viewing them like mythology. Let's watch stories of how apes became dominant, then let's watch stories about what happens after an astronaut comes back and discovers they're dominant. I'm just saying that I don't think these newer films can be called prequels until we see what happens in the future. And if it seems like it is 100% the intention that they literally lead to POTA 68 rather than a separate story similar to it. But they could do it. Maybe I intentionally inspired them to do it and it's all my fault by making this video. But I still love this franchise either way, the old and the new. Thanks for tuning in to Steven Shinder Reviews in video form, and I'll see you all soon.